The phone rang just once before I picked it up. Mom never let it ring twice. Her voice came through the line like a blade wrapped in silk. "We're not funding this circus." 3 seconds of silence stretched so thin I could hear my own pulse. Outside my apartment window, the morning looked ordinary, sunlight crawling across the kitchen tile, the kettle beginning to hiss. But inside me, something was breaking open. A circus, that's what she called the wedding. My wedding. "Mom, what are you?" "It's final, Eleanor. The vendors are notified. It's over." Behind her words I could hear the faint clinking of dishes, as if she'd timed the call between brunch courses. Shannon's laugh floated in the background, sharp, practiced, pleased. I said one word. "Understood." And then I hung up. For a moment the apartment was painfully quiet, the kind of quiet that exposes every hum of the refrigerator, every breath you're suddenly aware of taking. I stood still, kettle screaming behind me, until the steam fogged the counter glass. Understood. The word echoed that it used to mean peace, the way a soldier lowers a weapon, but today it sounded different, like a match striking. I didn't cry that I drove. The road blurred beneath me, streetlights flicking like frames of a film I no longer recognized myself in. Eric called again and again, but I couldn't answer. I needed to hear the sound of tires over asphalt, something that still obeyed physics when everything else felt unreal. By the time I reached the old brick house on Hawthorne Drive, the one that smelled of polished wood and judgment, my stomach had hardened into stone. She was waiting. Of course she was. Mom stood near the fireplace, arms folded across her pastel sweater set, the picture of composed victory. Dad hovered nearby, silent shadow as always. Shannon lounged on the sofa scrolling through her phone like an audience member bored with the performance. I stepped inside. The air was perfumed with her favorite lilies, white, pure, suffocating. "We're not funding this circus," she repeated, as if the words deserved an encore. "Better luck next time," Shannon murmured without looking up. Something inside me tilted. The sound of their certainty felt rehearsed, ancient, like they'd been waiting for this scene all along. I wanted to shout, to ask why now, to demand they look at me instead of through me. But years of training whispered back, "Don't make it worse. Keep your tone steady. Control means survival." So I smiled, barely. "Understood," I said again. Mom blinked, thrown off by how calm I sounded. That was the first moment of her confusion, though she didn't know it yet. The drive home felt longer. Clouds thickened until the sky turned pewter. Rain threatened but refused to fall. When I parked, I sat behind the wheel for a full minute, fingers locked around the steering column. Inside the apartment, the invitations waited on the counter, cream paper, gold trim, embossed with our names. I ran my thumb over the raised letters, then swept them into a box. The sound was soft, final, like earth over a coffin. Eric arrived just before dusk, breathless, rain dots on his jacket. "What happened?" "They canceled it," I said flatly. "They canceled?" He looked stunned. "They can't just." "They did." "Eleanor." "No," I cut him off gently. "This time it's my turn." He reached for me, but I was already walking toward the old storage drawer by the window. Beneath layers of forgotten bills and tangled cords lay my high school sketchbook, the one Mom had thrown out years ago, the one I'd secretly retrieved from the trash before garbage day. I opened it. Graphite lines bloomed like ghosts. Dresses, blazers, the kind of designs that had once filled my weekends with quiet hope. My finger traced the curve of a sleeve, something burned behind my ribs, defiance, faint but alive. That night, while Eric slept beside me, I wrote a list, every account. Every vendor. Every cent connected to the wedding. By dawn, unease had replaced heartbreak. How had she canceled everything so fast? Venues don't evaporate overnight. Contracts require signatures. Deposits, confirmations. There had to be more. Morning light fell pale across my desk as I called the Ivy House. The coordinator's voice was too careful. "I'm sorry, Miss Perry, but your mother already sent the signed cancellation notice." "My what?" "It had your signature." My stomach dropped. For a second I couldn't breathe. "Could you send me a copy?" When the PDF arrived, I stared at it until the lines blurred. My name, sprawled in ink that tried too hard to mimic my hand. Close, almost perfect, but not mine. Someone had forged me. It wasn't just control anymore, that IT was theft, erasure. I drove to Diane Cole's office. The city still half asleep. Diane had once handled legal filings for our firm, steel-eyed, calm, precise. The kind of woman who could silence a room by adjusting her glasses. She listened without interruption, pen tapping rhythm on her pad. When I slid the documents across her desk, she examined each page slowly, lips pressed thin. Finally, she looked up. "This cancellation form," she said, "that isn't your handwriting." Her tone left no space for doubt. "Someone forged it. If they used your financial information to make or cancel payments, that's criminal, Eleanor." The word criminal landed like a verdict that I wasn't the disobedient daughter anymore. I was a plaintiff waiting to be born. That night I sat in darkness, lit only by the laptop glow. Transaction history scrolled past. Dates aligned too neatly. Thousands transferred to Shannon Perry Designs. More to my parents' credit cards. Home renovations. Debt payments. Each line of numbers whispered the same sentence: they took your future to fund their comfort. My hands shook. Then steadied that I typed a message to Diane. "We're filing the case." And then, aloud, to the empty room. They wanted control. Now they'll get consequences. Sleep didn't come. Memories did. A different house, same silence. Me at 12, standing in front of the fireplace, holding a sketchbook with trembling hands. Mom's pearls catching the light as she said, "You're not wasting your life on fantasies." Dad nodding from the shadows, Shannon giggling from the sofa. The same choreography, only smaller bodies. Back then, I'd said understood, too, because silence kept the peace, because love meant obedience. Now I knew better. Silence could also be a weapon. The next morning, the phone rang again. Uncle Stephen. We hadn't spoken in months. His voice carried unease, the kind that precedes confessions. "Eleanor, there's something you need to know. It's about your grandfather's trust fund." My breath caught. "He set it up for you, $250,000. It activates only when you marry. Your parents have been managing it and withdrawing from it." The world tilted. They used it for Shannon's boutique. For the house remodel. If you'd gone through with the wedding, an audit would have triggered automatically. They had to stop it. I closed my eyes. The betrayal tasted metallic, like blood in the mouth. When I hung up, the apartment felt too small to contain the rage building inside it. I opened a new document on my laptop, title, Perry vs. Perry, Preliminary Evidence. For the first time, my name looked right beside theirs, not beneath. And that was how the circus began to collapse, not with shouting, not with tears, but with quiet precision, the same precision my mother once taught me to survive her world. I smiled at the irony. This time, her own lessons would undo her. Diane's office smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink the morning she called me back in. "We're ready," she said. "But before we file, you need to understand, once we start, there's no going back." Her eyes searched mine for hesitation. There wasn't any left. I nodded. "They took my name. They don't get to keep my silence." She smiled, barely, the kind of smile a soldier gives before battle. For the next 2 weeks, we lived in evidence, emails, receipts, contracts. Diane's assistant pinned every document across a corkboard until it looked like a map of deceit. Red thread connecting every payment, every forged signature, every lie that masqueraded as love. Late nights blurred into early mornings that I learned how fraud breathes, slowly, predictably, confident that no one will ever pull back the curtain, until someone does. Each discovery stung, but with it came clarity. Mom's generosity at holidays. Dad's sudden upgrades, the car, the kitchen remodel. Shannon's boutique grand opening, the champagne tower she'd bragged about, all of it paid with my inheritance. Eric tried to keep pace. He brought me coffee, wrapped me in tired hugs, whispered, "You're doing the right thing." But at night, when he thought I was asleep, I could feel his worry pressing through the mattress like a heartbeat. He didn't know how deep this would go, neither did I. When the filing went public, the calls began, unknown numbers, blocked IDs, relatives suddenly concerned. Aunt Margot left a message dripping with disbelief. "Honey, family fights aren't meant for courtrooms. You'll regret this." I deleted it. Mom didn't call, she sent a single email. "You're humiliating us. Please reconsider before it's too late." Too late had already happened. It happened the moment she forged my name. Court dates move slowly, but gossip travels fast. By the time we appeared before the judge, the local paper had already printed, "Daughter sues parents over wedding scandal." I almost laughed at the absurdity, my private grief distilled into a headline. That morning, the courthouse corridor buzzed with murmurs. Reporters waited near the vending machine, pretending not to. I walked past them in a navy suit, hair pinned back, holding Diane's case file like armor. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above rows of wooden benches, the air smelled of polish and nerves. Case number 4721, Perry versus Perry. The clerk's voice echoed, each syllable sliced. Mom sat across the aisle, pearls perfectly aligned, face carved from calm. Dad looked smaller than I remembered. Shannon twirled her phone until the bailiff told her to put it away. Diane rose. "Your Honor, this case concerns the unauthorized use of my client's financial assets and a forged signature on legally binding documents." Her tone was steady, precise, every word landed like a hammer. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, the cancellation form, the transfers, the trust fund withdrawals. Each page she handed the judge sounded heavier than paper should. When Uncle Stephen took the stand, I watched his hands tremble around the oath card. Eleanor's grandfather created a trust of $250,000 for her, he testified. It would release upon her marriage. I discovered funds missing, withdrawn by Robert and Carol Perry. The courtroom rustled. Mom's lawyer objected, voice sharp. "Irrelevant. Family management rights apply." Diane didn't flinch. "Family rights don't extend to forgery, counsel." The judge nodded once, objection overruled. Then Mom spoke, her voice wavered for the first time. "We were protecting her," she said. "That boy, Eric, he's beneath her. We couldn't Weeks later, their calls began, first Mom, then Dad, then Shannon, voicemails dripping remorse. "Sweetheart, can we meet? Things got out of hand." I didn't answer. The phone buzzed against the counter while I folded laundry, sketched new designs, lived. Each ring grew softer until silence returned. Then one voicemail stopped me cold, Mom's voice, brittle. "Your father lost his job. Shannon's boutique is gone. We need help." I listened once, deleted it. Not out of anger, just acceptance. They had taken enough. The night after that call, messages came again, back to back until the screen glowed like an alarm. This time, I typed only 4 words. "The circus is full." Then I set the phone face down, poured another glass of wine, and returned to my sketchbook. Pencil lines flowed easily again. Freedom, it turned out, looked a lot like quiet persistence. By morning, sunlight spilled across my desk, warming the scattered swatches of fabric. Eric kissed my forehead before heading to work. I stayed there, sketching the first dress of my own line, no signatures but mine. Outside, birds argued over crumbs. Inside, everything was still. Peace wasn't loud. It was steady. It was earned. Mom once said my wedding was a circus. Maybe she was right, because now the show was over, and I was the one who walked away smiling. Peace, I learned, is not a sound. It's an absence of pleading, of explanation, of walking on eggshells just to be loved. In the weeks that followed the trial, I stopped counting days by court filings or phone rings that I started measuring them by small, ordinary things, the smell of coffee at dawn, the hum of the sewing machine, the weight of fabric between my fingers. It's strange how normal life feels when you've spent years mistaking control for care. The first morning after the final hearing, I woke before sunrise. For a long time, I just sat at the edge of the bed, watching the light climb over the blinds. Eric was still asleep, breathing slow and steady. I whispered into the quiet. It's over. But the truth was, endings aren't sharp, they dissolve, slowly, quietly, until you look back and realize the war you were fighting no longer exists. A week later, Diane called. How are you holding up? I smiled at her voice. Better than I expected. Good. Anne. Eleanor? Yes? Don't let this case define you. You won because you remembered who you were before they told you otherwise. I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted salt. Thank you, I said softly. For helping me remember. Just promise me one thing, she added. Use that memory for something that's yours. Her words stayed. That afternoon, I returned to the old storage box, the one that once held invitations to a wedding that never happened. That I emptied it. Every gold-trimmed card went into the recycling bin. Then, into the same box, I placed something new, a sketchbook, a measuring tape, a spool of thread. A beginning where an ending used to be. By late autumn, my small apartment had transformed. Bolts of fabric leaned against the walls, sunlight pooling across half-finished designs. That I called it the Ivy Line, a quiet nod to the venue that witnessed both my collapse and my rebirth. At first, it was just me. One woman, one sewing machine, and a dream that had once been forbidden. Then came orders, slowly, almost shyly, from local brides who wanted something simple, human, real, the kind of beauty you could breathe in. Every stitch felt like reclaiming something my mother once called a waste of time. One afternoon, as I packed a finished gown into its box, the doorbell rang. A delivery man handed me an envelope. The handwriting was familiar, tight, neat, deliberate. Eleanor Perry. I didn't open it right away. It sat on my counter while I made tea, fed the cat, watered the fern. Finally, curiosity outweighed old scars. Inside were photographs, me as a child, in a yellow dress I'd loved, smiling at the camera while my mother fixed my hair. No letter. No apology, just proof that once, even she had seen me happy. I placed the photos back inside and tied the envelope with string. Not forgiveness, not anger, just closure. Some things don't need to be answered, they just need to stop echoing. Winter came early that year. Frost framed the window, and the world outside looked like still water. Eric and I spent evenings wrapped in blankets, planning nothing, just being. He'd read, I'd sketch, the sound of his page turn syncing with the rhythm of my pencil. You're quiet, he'd say sometimes. I like the quiet, I'd answer. He'd smile. You used to be afraid of it. I used to think silence meant defeat. And now? Now it feels like peace. In December, I opened a small studio downtown, a converted florist shop with a cracked display window and floors that creaked when you walked. I painted the walls white, hung ivy above the door, and placed a single quote on the wall in gold letters. Understood. Visitors often asked what it meant. I'd smile and say, it means I finally understand myself. They'd nod politely, unaware that one word had once been my cage, and now, it was my freedom. One morning, a woman walked in, early 40s, nervous smile, fingers twisting a ring that wasn't there. She asked if I could make her a dress. Her wedding had been postponed 3 times, family issues. She said softly. I smiled in a way I hoped she understood. Tell me what you'd like, I said. She hesitated. Something that feels like me. When she returned 2 weeks later for the fitting, she stood in front of the mirror and whispered, I don't recognize myself. Then she smiled through tears. In a good way. I watched her reflection and saw a version of myself, years ago, before the noise, before the manipulation. Maybe this was what healing looked like, helping others remember who they were before someone told them they weren't enough. That night, I locked the studio and walked along the snowy street. City lights shimmered across the frost. Somewhere, a busker played a slow tune on an old violin. For a moment, everything felt suspended, beautiful, fragile, alive. I thought about my family then, where they might be if they'd ever learned what love looks like when it isn't chained to control. I didn't wish them suffering, that I wished them distance. Sometimes mercy is not reunion, it's letting people live with what they built. Spring arrived like an apology, soft rain, new leaves, air that smelled of second chances. The ivy line grew quietly, customer by customer, each dress carried a story, each woman left lighter than when she came. I never told them about the courtroom, or the trust fund, or the mother who called love a circus that I didn't need to. Pain, I learned, doesn't need translation, it recognizes its own kind. One evening, after closing, I received an email from an unknown address, subject line, a note from MOM.my hand hovered over the mouse. The message was short. I saw your interview in the paper. The dresses are beautiful, that I was wrong, that I hope you're happy. No signature. No excuses, just a single line that felt both too little and, somehow, enough. I closed the laptop and stared at the empty shop. A tear fell, then another, quiet as rain on glass. I whispered. I am. Months passed, success came, not in waves, but in steady ripples. One magazine featured at a local award for ethical design, then national interest. But what meant most wasn't the recognition, it was the silence after applause, that breath between achievements where I could finally hear myself think. For years, I'd been performing roles, dutiful daughter, perfect accountant, polite fiancé. Now, I was simply Eleanor. No titles, no conditions, just me. The night before the Ivy Line's first anniversary, I sat by the window with a glass of wine. The city pulsed below, neon signs, distant laughter, the faint hum of possibility. Eric joined me, slipping an arm around my shoulder. Penny for your thoughts? I smiled. I was just thinking about how strange life is, how the same word, understood, used to mean surrender, and now it means freedom. He kissed my temple. Maybe it always meant both. You just had to choose which one to live. I nodded, letting the truth settle. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the studio. On the counter sat a single white rose. No note, no sender, just a flower, delicate and unguarded. I placed it in a vase by the window, maybe from a customer, maybe not. It didn't matter. I had learned to stop searching for meaning in every gesture. Sometimes beauty simply exists. That afternoon, I met with a young intern, a shy girl from the community college. She reminded me of myself at 19, all nerves and eagerness. Miss Perry, she asked timidly, how did you know this was your calling? I thought about it for a long moment before answering. I didn't. I just knew what wasn't, and once you know what doesn't belong to you, everything else becomes clear. She nodded, writing it down as if it were a rule, but it wasn't a rule. It was a release. That night, after closing, I stood again beneath the ivy arch outside the shop. The same name, different life, the street was quiet, the air warm, the future open. I thought about Mom's words, we're not funding this circus. Maybe she'd been right in a way she never intended, because I no longer needed their tent, their applause, their permission. My life wasn't a circus anymore. It was a canvas. And as I locked the door, I whispered the final truth. The show is over, and I am finally free. Epilogue, the lesson of the circus. If you've ever been silenced by the people who claim to love you, if you've ever mistaken obedience for peace, if you've ever had to build yourself from the rubble of someone else's control, then you already know what Eleanor learned. That sometimes, revenge isn't loud. It's not a courtroom victory or a headline. It's waking up one day and realizing you no longer need them to believe your story. It's choosing calm over chaos, creation over approval, and silence, not as surrender, but as proof that you've outgrown the noise. So if this story resonated with you, take a breath, pour yourself a glass of something honest, and remember, you are allowed to rewrite the script. The first spring thunder came early that year, lightning stitched across the clouds as rain drummed the roof of my studio, every flash threw shadows of mannequins across the wall, headless silhouettes, poised mid-motion, like dancers frozen between applause and silence. I'd stayed late that night, finishing a design for a charity gala. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied. Outside, the streetlights shimmered against puddles. Inside, I watched thread feed through the needle, steady as breath. Each stitch felt like punctuation in a sentence I was finally allowed to write. I sometimes thought about the courtroom then, not the verdict, but the sound before it, that single second of stillness when truth filled the room and no one dared move. That it reminded me that silence, once a weapon used against me, had become my strength, that even in thunder, there can be peace if you've learned how to listen for it. A few months later, the Ivy Line partnered with a small nonprofit that provided gowns for women rebuilding their lives after hardship, divorce, loss, homelessness. I taught weekend workshops on simple sewing, how to turn fabric scraps into something beautiful again. One woman, Lydia, arrived wearing sleeves that hid scars. She rarely spoke, but by the third session, she began humming softly as she worked, a tune I didn't recognize. When she finished her dress, she whispered, "It's not perfect." I smiled. "Neither are we. But look how well we hold together." She laughed, a real, surprised laugh that cracked something open in the room. That's when I understood. Healing isn't personal. It multiplies quietly through others. Eric watched all of this with the kind of pride that doesn't need words. He'd started volunteering at the same nonprofit, mentoring young teens who'd grown up believing their worth depended on someone else's approval. Sometimes he'd come home with stories that broke and mended my heart in the same breath. That we were building different things from the same truth. That love without control feels like breathing after years underwater. One night in June, I found an old voicemail buried deep in my phone, one of Mom's early messages I'd never deleted. Her voice was sharp, confident, untouched by regret. "Call me back, Eleanor. You're making a mistake." For a moment I just listened to the silence after her sentence, wondering what she would think if she saw me now. Maybe she'd still call it rebellion, maybe she'd call it pride. Either way, it no longer required her permission to exist. I pressed delete. The screen blinked once, then cleared, like erasing a word that had never belonged in the story. Summer deepened, the studio thrived, orders poured in from out of state, interviews followed. People loved the story of the designer who turned a cancelled wedding into a fashion house. They called it poetic, but it never felt like poetry to me. It felt like survival written in fabric and thread. I refused large investors, even when the offers glittered. Freedom was non-negotiable. Every contract carried a single clause at the top, written in my hand. All creative decisions remain with Eleanor Perry. No lawyer ever argued with it. The firmness in my tone did the work. One afternoon, as I was leaving the studio, a familiar figure stood outside the window, older, smaller somehow, Mom. For a moment I froze, hand on the doorframe, heart racing with the reflex of the past. She caught my eye through the glass and smiled, tentatively, almost shyly. I opened the door but didn't step closer. "You look well," she said, her voice trembled around the edges, stripped of authority. "So do you," I managed. "I wanted to see it," she continued, glancing at the sign above the window. "The Ivy Line. I read about it in the paper." I nodded. Rain began to fall, soft, forgiving. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small box. "It's your grandmother's thimble," she said. "She taught me to sew once. I thought, you might want it." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then I took it, metal cool against my palm. "Thank you," I said simply. She nodded, eyes wet, and turned to leave. No speeches, no apologies, just two women standing at the edge of peace. When she disappeared into the rain, I closed the door and placed the thimble on my work table. For the first time, the past felt finished. That night, I dreamt of my younger self, the girl sketching dresses under her blanket with a flashlight. She looked at me and smiled. "We did it," she whispered. I woke with tears on my cheeks and laughter in my throat. Autumn returned, gentle and golden. The nonprofit held its annual gala at the Ivy House, the same venue where my wedding had once been cancelled. They asked if I would design the centerpiece dress for the charity auction. I agreed. When I arrived, I paused beneath the familiar archway. The garden lights flickered softly. For a moment, memory overlapped reality. Mom's voice, Shannon's laughter, the sting of humiliation. Then the sounds faded, replaced by music, genuine and warm. Inside, guests moved through the hall, admiring the displays. My design stood at the center, ivory silk embroidered with ivy leaves in gold thread. I'd stitched the final pattern by hand, one leaf for each year it had taken to grow free. A woman beside me whispered. It's beautiful. Who's the designer? I smiled. Someone who finally stopped asking for permission. Later that evening, as the auction concluded, the host invited me to speak. That I walked to the podium, heartbeat steady, lights soft on my face. A few years ago, I stood in this same room and lost everything I thought mattered. That I believed silence kept me safe, but I learned that silence, when used with courage, can also rebuild you, because sometimes the loudest revenge is simply living well, and living kindly. Applause rose, gentle at first, then swelling like rain against windows. That I looked out over the crowd and saw faces I didn't know, strangers who understood anyway. In that moment, I felt something shift. The story wasn't about loss anymore. That it was about inheritance, the kind that can't be stolen, forged, or cancelled. When I returned home, the city was asleep. Eric waited by the window, 2 mugs of tea steaming on the sill. He handed me one and asked, "How did it feel?" I thought for a long moment before answering. Like closing a circle. He smiled. Then here's to circles. We clinked cups. Outside, the rain began again, steady, forgiving, eternal. Weeks later, I received another letter, this one handwritten in looping script. That it was from Shannon. Eleanor, I'm sorry. Not for what happened, I can't undo that, but for never seeing you as more than competition. You were right. Failure did teach me that. I hope you're happy. I folded the letter and placed it next to Mom's thimble. 2 relics of the life that built me through breaking. Then I wrote a single reply. I am. I truly am. The years that followed blurred into something soft and ordinary. The studio expanded, then stabilized. Eric and I bought a small house with creaky floors and a garden that smelled of mint. On quiet Sundays, I'd sit outside, sketchbook balanced on my knees, and watch the light shift through the trees. Sometimes I'd catch myself whispering old words, understood. Circus. Control, but they no longer hurt. They were ghosts that had learned their place, shadows that only appear when the sun is strong enough. Final reflection. Looking back, I realized the story was never about a cancelled wedding. That it was about a woman uncanceling herself. It was about the moment when silence stopped meaning surrender and started meaning sovereignty, about how forgiveness doesn't always come wrapped in reunion. It sometimes arrives in the quiet ability to live without bitterness. If you've been there, if you've lost yourself inside someone else's expectations, I hope you know this: you can start again, even from ashes, even from betrayal, especially from betrayal. Because peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the mastery of your own boundaries within it. So if this story resonated with you, take a moment, breathe, think about the word that once held you captive, and consider what it might mean if you rewrote it in your own voice. Because one day, you'll look back, and the noise will be gone, the tent lights will dim, and you'll realize the circus ended not when they walked away, but when you finally did. If this story touched you, share it with someone who's still learning to be free, and remember, silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it's wisdom.